I've been through a lot in the past few months, and I think sharing my story here might be helpful for others. My name is Jade. I'm a 29-year-old woman. I've been married to my husband Martin, who is 30. I've been with my boyfriend for about 3 years now. We didn't have any kids because we were hoping to have some in a few years' time. Martin and I met in college. It was kind of love at first sight for him. The truth is I was only with him for his money. I lost that out in the end. He found out I was cheating on him and he's in the process of divorcing me after destroying my reputation and relationships. I know you might be wondering how, so I'm going to give you some background. I met Martin in college, but the truth is I had been tracking him for a while before we actually crossed paths. I had heard of Martin and his family, who were very wealthy, and I knew that marrying him would be an easy way out of the poverty I had grown up in, literally in the slums. The moment I saw him, I knew I needed someone who could take care of me, so I latched on to him. I pretended to bump into him at a college party and messaged him the next day on Instagram. That's how it all started. I was a gold digger, and he never knew. I was hoping to marry him and then divorce him, taking half of his money. But his parents must have seen through me. They made sure to protect their son and their family's wealth. I met Martin at a college party and we got on really well. He didn't ask for my number, so I messaged him on Instagram the next day. I was the one who pursued him at that time. Martin had just come out of a relationship and wasn't looking to date again for a while. However, when he saw how much I liked him, he agreed to go out with me. He asked me out, but to be honest, at first I didn't really like him for who he was. I was just attracted to his handsome face and his wealth. Our first date was at a fancy restaurant in the city. Martin was really generous and I was impressed. We talked for hours and I found myself enjoying his company more than I had expected. He was charming, intelligent, and genuinely interested. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but notice how attractive Martin was. I was drawn to his wealth and the lifestyle he could offer me, despite my initial intentions. I kept things light, not wanting to reveal my true motives just yet. By the end of the night, I knew that Martin was someone who could provide me with the life I had always dreamed of. I was still in the dark about a few things, though. I was already starting to see that my plans for a quick marriage and divorce were going to be difficult to pull off, which was leading to a pretty heartbreaking situation. Our second date was a week later, and Martin had planned a romantic evening at a rooftop bar overlooking the city skyline. The setting was perfect, and I couldn't help but feel excited at the thought of what the future could hold with him. We had cocktails and chatted. I got to know Martin better. He was kind and attentive, asking about my life and really listening to my answers. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't expected, despite my initial intentions. I was starting to enjoy Martin's company for more than just his wealth. There was something about him that drew me in, something genuine and kind. By the end of the night, I knew I was falling for Martin. I was still a bit reluctant to fully commit, but I couldn't deny that he was starting to mean more to me than just a way out of poverty. For our third date, he surprised me with tickets to a concert of my favorite band. It was a thoughtful gesture, and I was starting to see him in a different light. Despite my growing feelings for Martin, I was still motivated by his wealth. At the concert, I couldn't help but notice how Martin looked at me with genuine affection. This made me question my initial intentions and whether I was being fair to him. However, the allure of financial security was still strong. After the concert, Martin took me to a cozy cafe and we talked for hours. He shared stories about his childhood, his dreams for the future, and his family. I found myself drawn to his sincerity and authenticity, and my feelings for him continued to grow by the end of the night. I was beginning to see Martin in a different light. I knew I was falling for him, but I was still feeling guilty about my true intentions. After several months of dating, Martin invited me to move in with him. By that point, I had already made up my mind about our future together. I wasn't that bothered about school anymore. Why focus on my studies when I would soon be a stay-at-home mom? I was at a bit of a loss. I was living off Martin's wealth, but I was happy to be home with my family. I was excited about the prospect of moving in with Martin, as I thought it would be a great opportunity to start our life together. When I settled into Martin's luxurious home, I realized that I was really pleased that I'd achieved my goal of a life of financial stability. I was determined to make the most of it. I didn't realize that my decision to prioritize my relationship with Martin over my education would lead to the difficult situation I'm in now. I met Marco when I was the same age as him. He was extremely charming and quickly became a part of our friend group. Everyone liked Marco. He was charming, friendly, and handsome, although not as handsome as Martin, of course. Marco started flirting with me discreetly, knowing that Martin was also in our friend group. We all knew that Marco was careful because we were a couple. He started private messaging me, and I have to admit I enjoyed the attention as Marco and I got to know each other better. He expressed his desire for me to leave Martin. However, I knew that I couldn't do that. Martin was my source of income, and I couldn't afford to lose that. Security, I told Marco. He got it. Marco and I came up with a plan. I'd marry Martin, then divorce him after a year or so. I'd claim alimony or something similar. It seemed like the perfect solution to my problems. It'd secure my financial future. I was willing to take the risk in order to secure my future, while also being with Marco. As my relationship with Martin progressed, I began to subtly hint at the idea of marriage. I would casually bring up the topic in conversation, mentioning how much I admired couples who were committed to each other for life. I also dropped hints about my desire to settle down and start a family, mentioning how I had always dreamed of having children. I knew that Martin was hesitant about marriage, but I was determined to change his mind. I often talked about our future together, painting a picture of a happy and stable life as husband and wife. I would tell him how much I loved him and how I couldn't imagine spending my life with anyone else. Despite my efforts, Martin remained hesitant about marriage. He would brush off my hints, saying that he wanted to focus on our relationship and not rush into anything. Little did he know back then that I had already made up my mind about our future. I was willing to do whatever it took to secure my place in his life, even if it meant resorting to manipulation and deceit. As Marco and I grew closer, he began to pressure me to make Martin marry me. He argued that marrying Martin was the key to securing my financial future. Marco and I had a few arguments about it, as he was getting frustrated with my lack of progress. I had to explain to him that Martin wasn't easily influenced and that things like this take time. I reassured Marco that I was doing everything I could to make Martin see things my way. I even thought about getting pregnant to strengthen our bond and make him more likely to propose. However, Martin was very careful and always insisted on using protection. He had made it clear that he didn't want kids until his 30s, which made my plan more challenging. Marco and I also discussed it. We discussed it several times, with Marco arguing that having a child with Martin would make leaving him much harder and would be too much work. I knew he was right, but the thought of losing Martin's financial support was too much to bear as my relationship with Marco deepened. So did his demands for me to extract more money. From Martin, he was persistent in his pursuit of financial gain, urging me to push Martin even harder to marry me and secure my financial future. However, getting more money from Martin wasn't as straightforward as Marco thought. Despite Marco's pressure, Martin was cautious with his finances. I knew that pushing Martin too far could have negative consequences. It all backfired and put my goal of marrying him in jeopardy. Looking back, I saw that Marco was a red flag, but at the time I was blinded by my desire for financial security and my likeness of Marco. I ignored the warning signs, convincing myself that Marco had my best interest at heart. I continued to subtly pressure. I dropped hints about our future together, hoping that Martin would eventually come around to the idea. After months of subtle hints and pressure, Martin finally came around to the idea of marriage. He surprised me with a romantic proposal during a weekend getaway to the countryside. It was a beautiful moment. I was over the moon. I accepted his proposal without hesitation, feeling like all my dreams were finally coming true. As soon as Martin slipped the ring on my finger, I excused myself to go to the bathroom. Instead, I hurriedly dialed Marco's number. My heart was racing with excitement when he answered. I was so happy I couldn't contain it when I told Marco the news. He was really happy for us, and we celebrated this big step in our plan. At the time, I didn't realize that things were about to go wrong. The next week, Marco wanted to celebrate with me. It was a big step in our plan. We went to a fancy restaurant where we toasted to our future success. Marco was thrilled, and his excitement was infectious. After dinner, Marco suggested we continue the celebration at his place. I agreed, as I was eager to spend more time with him. We spent the night together, celebrating our shared triumph. I felt like I was an important character in the movie Money Heist, except my heist was in real life. The next morning, I lied to Martin, telling him that I had gone to visit my parents and had spent the night with them. I felt a pang of guilt as I said the words, but I quickly pushed it aside. Meeting Martin's parents was a nerve-wracking experience. From the moment we walked in, it was clear that they didn't like me. They could smell a gold digger a mile away and didn't even try to hide it. They were rude and dismissive, making snide comments and giving me cold looks. I tried to be polite and friendly, but it was clear that nothing I did would change their opinion of me. Martin did his best to defend me, insisting that they give me a chance. His parents eventually relented, but it was clear that their apology was insincere. They still didn't despite their hostility. I was determined to win them over. I knew that their approval was important to Martin and I was willing to do whatever it took to make them think that I truly cared for him. I was wrong. My efforts would be in vain and their dislike for me would never end. In contrast, when Martin met my parents, they instantly loved him. They welcomed him with open arms, making him feel like part of the family from the very beginning. Watching Martin interact with my family, I couldn't help but feel a little jealous. Martin was charming and kind, and it was clear that my parents thought highly of him. When I watched him bond with my family, I began to see him in a new light. I realized that I actually liked him, despite my initial intentions. However, I was in too deep to pull out now. I had come too far to turn back. I knew that I had to continue with my charade, even if it meant hurting Martin in the end. As Martin and I began planning our wedding, it became clear that it would be a lavish affair. We decided on a destination. Wedding and Martin's parents were kind enough to cover the costs of the event. It was a dream come true and I was really excited at the thought of marrying Martin in such a beautiful setting. We spent weeks planning every detail from the venue to the decorations to the guest list. Martin's parents were very involved in the planning process and I was grateful for their support and generosity while planning our lavish destination wedding. I quickly realized that it came with its own set of challenges. The pressure to create the perfect day was immense. I was constantly stressed and overwhelmed. There were endless decisions to be made, from choosing the venue to selecting the menu to finding the perfect dress. Martin's parents had specific ideas about how the wedding should be, and I often found myself at odds with them over certain details. The cost of the wedding was also a source of stress. While Martin's parents were funding the event, I couldn't help but feel guilty about the extravagant amount of money being spent. I knew that I was taking advantage of their generosity, but I was too focused on my own desires to stop and, as the wedding day drew nearer, I couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. I knew that I was deceiving Martin and his family, and it weighed heavily on my conscience despite the challenges and guilt. However, I was determined to see our wedding through. I wanted nothing more than to secure my future with Martin, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness in the process. Just when I thought everything was going smoothly with the wedding planning, Martin's parents hit me with a bombshell. I was shocked and upset when I was asked to sign a prenuptial agreement to protect Martin's assets. This wasn't part of my plan at all. Signing a prenup would ruin everything I had worked so hard for. I tried to disagree and even accused Martin of not trusting me. I argued with his parents, trying to convince them to change their minds. But they were adamant. They said it was necessary to protect Martin's wealth. Martin wanted to avoid further conflict, so he urged me to just sign the prenup and let his parents leave us. I knew I had no choice if I didn't sign. If I did, they'd see right through my charade. I was really upset. I even confided in Marco, hoping for some kind of solution. But even he was at a loss. He advised me to press Martin and his parents, but it was clear that they weren't going to budge. I had to sign the prenup as a gift. Martin's parents offered to buy us a house in any location of our choosing. However, the house would also be in Martin's name and protected by the prenup. The prenup changed everything between Marco and me. We couldn't go back to the drawing board and change our plan to get divorced after a year or two. It would be obvious that I wouldn't get anything from the marriage because of the prenup. I had two choices: marry Martin and have kids to get child support, or wait until he died to inherit his money. But who knew how long Martin would live? I couldn't afford to wait that long. I needed a plan that would guarantee me some financial security. After a lot of discussion, Marco and I decided on a new plan. I decided to marry Martin and try to get as much money from him as possible. I would save every penny I could, cutting back on my extravagant spending habits. If Martin gave me money for clothes, I would save most of it and only spend a fraction on what I needed. It was a drastic change from my previous lifestyle, but I knew it was necessary if I wanted to secure my future. I had grown up poor and had never experienced the finer things in life until I met Martin. I loved spending, but I realized that if I wanted to get anything out of this marriage, I had to save. I tried to save as much as I could and ask Martin for as much money as possible. There was a moment when I considered abandoning my plan and staying with Martin. I thought about betraying Marco and taking whatever financial security I could get from my marriage with Martin, but Marco made it clear that if I did that, he would expose everything to Martin. I couldn't allow that to happen. If Martin found out the truth, he would divorce me immediately, and all my efforts would have been for nothing. I had to continue with our plan and play along with Marco. It was a tough call, but I knew that if I betrayed Marco, it would only lead to more trouble. I'd come too far to turn back now, so I had to see the plan through to the end. Our wedding day arrived, and it was everything I dreamed of. The ceremony was held at a picturesque location with the sun shining brightly overhead. Martin looked so handsome in his suit, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world as I walked down the aisle towards him. When we exchanged vows, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. I was deceiving Martin, and I knew that our marriage was built on a foundation of lies. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the life of luxury that awaited me after the ceremony. We celebrated with our friends and family, toasting to our future together. Martin's parents were beaming with pride, and I knew that was only because they had successfully screwed me over with the prenup. Now I couldn't dig Martin's gold. When the night came to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that I had a feeling that the road ahead would be difficult, but at the time I was too blind and determined to see everything to an end after our wedding. Martin and I went on a luxurious honeymoon to a tropical paradise, which was a blissful escape from reality. For a while, I was able to forget about the reception that was at the core of our marriage. When we returned, we settled into married life and things seemed to be going well. Martin was attentive and loving, and I played the part of the doting wife perfectly. However, behind closed doors I was still seeing Marco, but it got harder to keep up the pretense as time went on. I had to be careful not to leave any evidence of my affair, always watching my back for any signs that Martin might be suspicious. Despite the risks, I couldn't resist the thrill of my secret relationship with Marco. He was everything Martin wasn't: spontaneous and exciting. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I was willing to take the risk for the sake of my own happiness. I lied to Martin more times than I could count. I'd tell Martin I was going to visit my parents and stay over, but I was actually going to spend the night with Marco. I became an expert at deception, fabricating elaborate stories to cover up my affair. In hindsight, I realized how much I underappreciated Martin. Martin was a good man. He was kind and loving, and he deserved so much better than the lies and deceit I subjected him to. I regret the pain I caused him, the trust one betrayed, and the love I took for granted. In the moment, I was blinded by my own selfish desires. I was caught up in the excitement of my affair with Marco. I didn't stop to think about the consequences of my actions. I didn't think about the damage I was causing. Looking back, I feel ashamed and remorseful about my actions. I wish I could go back and change things to be the wife Martin deserved, but I know that I can't undo the past. I can only learn from my mistakes and try to be a better person in the future. Marco suggested that I tell Martin we should join our accounts together. He thought it would make it easier for me to access Martin's money. I could access Martin's money and gradually siphon it off without raising suspicion. I agreed to the plan, thinking it would be a step towards securing my financial future. However, when I broached the subject with Martin, he refused. He said he believed in maintaining separate accounts, but having a joint account for shared expenses and bills. I was disappointed as I had hoped to have more control over his finances. It was a reminder that I was trying to push boundaries despite my efforts to manipulate the situation. He remained steadfast in his beliefs, which made me realize that my actions have consequences and that I can't always get what I want. As time went on, I realized that Martin was inadvertently making it easy for me to siphon money from him when we first met. I had made it clear that I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. At the time, I was really disappointed. I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom and be treated like a princess, but Martin was taking that literally. He insisted on us keeping separate accounts with only a joint account for bills. This meant that he would often buy things for me instead of giving me the money directly. He was a much better shopper than I was, and he was able to spot a fake from a real just by looking at them. I, on the other hand, had grown up in the slums and didn't have an eye for spotting the difference. Martin's preference for buying things for me meant that if anything went missing, he would notice and I couldn't come up with a plausible excuse. It was a frustrating situation as I was unable to save or use the money for my own purposes, even for vacations. Martin would always be the one to book our tickets and make the arrangements. I was completely dependent on him financially, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain my double life with Marco. Whenever I complained about not having access to money, Martin would. He'd bring up the fact that I'd wanted to be treated like a princess. He'd remind me of my own words, and I couldn't dispute them. It was frustrating because while he occasionally gave me his card to go shopping, it was rare, and I couldn't use it without his knowledge. I couldn't buy items of lesser value either, as Martin would notice. He had a keen eye for quality and would often choose the best for me. It was surprising, as Martin was the most generous person I knew. He wasn't being greedy or selfish, he just preferred. I realized that I was in a situation where I was financially dependent on Martin. I couldn't save or spend money without his knowledge. It was a bit of a wake-up call. If I wanted to change things, I would have to find a way to do it without raising suspicion. 3 years into our marriage, I still couldn't save anything. Marco was getting impatient. He was frustrated by the fact that I hadn't been able to save any money at all in all this time. But the truth was Martin was just too smart, despite my best efforts to manipulate the situation. Martin always seemed to be one step ahead. He never gave me direct access to money, he always bought things for me himself. He was careful with his finances, and I couldn't find a way to get around his watchful eye. I realized that I was still stuck in a marriage where I had no financial independence. I was completely dependent on Martin and was still unable to save or spend money without his knowledge. It was frustrating. It was a pretty demoralizing situation. I knew that if I wanted to change things, I'd have to come up with a new plan, but I was trying so hard to come up with numerous plans, but nothing was working. Despite my inability to save money, I continued my secret affair with Marco. My resentment towards Martin for being so cautious with his finances grew, and I found myself pushing him away, unconsciously distancing myself from our marriage. I couldn't help but feel frustrated and trapped. My plan to secure my financial future was a losing battle, and I didn't know how to win. Marco's constant pressure only added to my stress, and I began to resent Martin for being so careful with his money. As the distance between us grew, I found solace in my affair with Marco. He was a welcome distraction from the problems in my marriage, and I enjoyed the excitement and thrill of our secret relationship. But deep down, I knew that I was only digging myself into a deeper hole. My marriage was crumbling, and I was to blame. I had let my greed and desire for financial security get the better of me. My judgment was clouded by security concerns, and I was now paying the price for continuing my affair with Marco. I noticed that Martin was also distancing himself from me. It seemed like he could sense that something was wrong. I realized that I needed to prioritize my marriage before it was too late. I knew I had to end things with Marco and focus on rebuilding my relationship with Martin, but Marco wasn't going to let me go easily. He had threatened to tell Martin. I had to be careful in my approach because I knew that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd be upset. So I subtly distanced myself from Marco by telling him that I wanted to regain Martin's trust and grow closer to him. I explained that I wouldn't be able to see him as often as before, despite his initial anger. Marco reluctantly agreed, knowing that I was the one who could help him make any progress regarding the money. I started to invest more time and effort into my marriage. I cooked more, took better care of the house, and made an effort to be more attentive. I tried to be more attentive to Martin's needs, even doing little things for him like offering massages after his long days at work. However, despite my efforts, it felt like there was still a significant distance between us. I started cooking more and taking care of the house more attentively, and I paid more attention to Martin, doing little things for him like offering him massages when he came back from work. However, it still felt like the bridge between us was too wide, even during the Christmas period. My parents invited us and some others for dinner at their place, and we went. I'd stopped visiting Marco, knowing that I needed to cut him off, but it seemed like he'd sensed my plan to detach, as he started calling me relentlessly. I regret not putting my phone on silent that day at Martin's parents' place. Things were going fine. Martin's parents had never really liked me, so they didn't include me much in their conversations, and kept giving me weird looks. Marco kept calling me, and at some point Martin and everyone noticed I was lying, saying it was a friend, and excused myself to go to the bathroom to take the call. I reassured Marco that I wasn't abandoning him and that I was just busy trying to get closer to Martin. I told him to stop calling because I was with Martin and his family, and he wouldn't want them finding out about our plan. Marco apologized, and we ended the call. When I came out of the bathroom, I bumped into Martin, who looked furious. I tried to play it off, but he knew he'd told me he'd known. He said he'd given me lots of chances to stop and think, but I'd kept going. He called me a horrible person and said that this was what I got for helping me improve my life and move out of the slums. At that point, Martin's parents joined us, and they gave me dirty looks. Then I realized that Martin had told them everything. They'd been eyeing me weirdly all night because he'd exposed my affair and my plan to deceive. I was really taken aback by what he said. I think I even started crying at one point, but my tears didn't fool anyone. Honestly, everything that happened feels so blurry in my head because I was so shocked. Martin stormed off because he was really angry and said he didn't want to hurt anyone. He drove off, leaving me stranded with no way home. I had to use money from my personal account to order an Uber when I got home. Martin was literally throwing my things onto the porch. I tried talking to him, but he wouldn't listen. He told me not to touch him and said he'd known about my affair with Marco for a long time. It was barely a month after we got married. He said he'd kept quiet for so long because he wanted to frustrate me and because he was heartbroken that I'd betrayed him like that. He said he was grateful his parents had insisted on the prenup, which protected him from losing everything. I had so many questions. If Martin had known for so long, why didn't he? I asked myself why he'd let it go on for so long. I realized that I'd lost so much. There was no getting through to Martin, no matter how hard I tried. After throwing out my clothes, Martin told me to never come back. He didn't even let me take my purses and jewelry. He said there was no way he'd let me sell them all. He gave me just my clothes. He then told me good luck finding a place to stay and said he would send divorce papers to my parents' house. I ordered another Uber because I didn't have much in my personal account and they would only last me for a few more rides. I was heading to my parents' place, but Martin had already called them. My mom was waiting outside and told me. She said there was no room for me there. She said I'd ruined my marriage and there was no way I could come back. The only other option was Marco's. I apologized to the Uber and gave him Marco's location. I was shocked to find out that Marco had also been cheating on me. A girl opened the door. She was wearing his clothes and she seemed comfortable. She told me she was Marco's girlfriend. I should have confronted him then and told her Marco was cheating, but I needed a place to stay. She called Marco and he was surprised to see me. I asked him who she was and we had an argument. He said he had a girlfriend since I was married and that he had the right to. I pleaded with him for a place to stay for a few days. And he finally agreed. I finally started feeling the full force of Martin's anger. It didn't take long and Marco was suddenly laid off from work for what seemed like no reason at all. They cited indecent behavior, but Marco insisted he had never been indecent at work. He came home angry and I knew it was definitely Martin's doing. Maybe Martin knew that I tried calling Martin to apologize, but it was clear Martin had a hand in it. Marco deserved it, but I didn't want to beg for him. Martin wouldn't pick up, and I think he even blocked me. After 2 days at Marco's place, he told me I had to leave. He insulted me, saying I was sloppy and that Martin only caught up to us because I hadn't been careful enough. He called me stupid and told me to leave. He thought Martin was the reason he got laid off. Martin's parents were wealthy and knew a lot of people, so it was likely that one of them got Marco fired. Thankfully, however, I later found out that Marco couldn't get a job after that because of Martin's influence. The last I heard of him, his life had taken a turn for the worse. I had to leave and go to a homeless shelter. It felt like a cruel twist of fate or karma's retribution. How did I go from living in a 7, I went from living in a house with a home theater, swimming pool and even a gym to staying in a homeless shelter? All because I listened to Marco and because of my greed. I realized that Marco hadn't even liked me. He just saw an opportunity to get rich quick through me and tried to capitalize on it. Now I was left with nothing. Martin still hasn't gotten in touch with me. The only communication I received was a text saying he was still working on the divorce papers and would send them to my parents' house. My parents also told me they would inform me once the papers arrived so I could come pick them up. I was told to come and pick them up. It was a harsh reality check and I couldn't help but wonder how I had fallen so low. So I guess my reason for sharing this story with you all is that I want to encourage you not to be greedy. If I hadn't been greedy and just worked on my relationship with Martin, I'd be in a much better place now. He's turned his back on me. I'm stuck and I don't even have a good degree. It'll be tough to find a well-paid job, and all my friends have turned their backs on me to support Martin. It's a lonely place to be. So the lesson here is don't cheat and don't be greedy. It's not worth it in the end.